You ever ignore the one person who could save your life? The shout cut through the warm California air like a crack of thunder. Call 911. He's not breathing. And for a split second, everything froze around the marble-lined pool of Daniel Brooks' $12 million mansion. The kind of place where the water shimmered like glass and every detail screamed power, success, untouchable wealth. But none of that mattered as Daniel lay flat on the deck, his perfectly pressed white shirt damp at the edges, his chest still, his world suddenly silent. Just 12 hours earlier, the scene couldn't have been more different, sunlight bouncing off. Designer sunglasses, champagne glasses clinking softly, investors laughing at Daniel's sharp jokes as he stood at the center of it all, confident, controlled, the kind of man who never got told no. Daniel Brooks didn't just own companies, he owned rooms, conversations, people's attention. And today was no different as he walked along the poolside inspecting every detail like a man who expected perfection from everything and everyone around him. That's when he saw her, Sophie Turner, kneeling near the pool's edge with a skimmer pole, quietly doing her job, her uniform simple, her presence almost invisible to everyone else, but somehow irritating to Daniel the moment he noticed her. "Hey," he called out, his tone sharp enough to slice through the laughter. "You planning to clean that today, or just decorate the place?" A few guests chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was Daniel, and when Daniel spoke, people reacted. Sophie looked up calmly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her expression steady, almost unreadable. "It'll be done in a few minutes, sir," she said politely, her voice even, but something about her composure only seemed to bother him more. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his sunglasses just enough to meet her eyes. "A few minutes? You realize this pool costs more than your yearly salary, right? Let's try to keep up." More laughter, louder this time, and Sophie simply nodded, returning to her work without another word. But as she moved along the edge, her eyes flicked briefly toward a small panel near the waterline, barely noticeable to anyone else, her brow tightening just slightly before she continued. Daniel turned back to his guests, dismissing her completely, already moving on to his next conversation, his next deal, his next moment of control. But behind him, unnoticed, Sophie paused again, her gaze lingering on that same spot. Something not quite right, something easy to ignore if you weren't paying attention. And Daniel Brooks had built his entire life on never needing to pay attention to things beneath him. Hours passed, the sun dipped lower, the party shifted, but that tiny detail remained, waiting, building, as if the universe itself was setting the stage for a moment Daniel would never see coming. Because sometimes the difference between power and vulnerability isn't money or status, it's what you choose to overlook. And right now, Daniel Brooks was overlooking the one thing that was about to change everything. The music grew louder as the afternoon slipped toward evening, and the glow of string lights began to reflect across the still surface of the pool, turning the entire backyard into a picture of effortless luxury, the kind of scene people posted online to prove they had made it. And at the center of it all, Daniel Brooks moved with the same confidence, shaking hands, closing deals, laughing at exactly the right moments, never once glancing back at the girl he had dismissed as if she were part of the furniture. But Sophie Turner had not forgotten what she saw, because as she continued her work along the edge of the water, her attention kept drifting back to that small electrical panel near the filtration system. A faint, irregular hum barely noticeable under the sound of conversation and music, yet persistent enough to make her pause again, her fingers tightening slightly around the pole as she leaned closer, careful not to draw attention, her eyes scanning the area with quiet focus. She had seen things like this before, not in places like this, not in mansions owned by billionaires, but in smaller, less polished environments where small problems could quickly turn into serious situations. And while everyone else saw perfection, she saw something incomplete, something off. Across the pool, Daniel raised his glass as someone congratulated him on a recent acquisition, his voice smooth and confident as he spoke about growth, expansion, control, words that came easily to a man who believed every outcome could be managed, every situation predicted. And yet only a few feet away from where he stood, something was already moving beyond his control. Sophie straightened up slowly, glancing around at the crowd, debating for a moment whether to say something, whether it was her place, because she knew how this worked. She knew how people like Daniel saw people like her. Interruptions were not welcome. Concerns were seen as inconveniences. And yet that faint hum did not stop. It lingered like a warning that refused to be ignored. She took a step toward the panel again, crouching slightly as she listened more closely, her expression tightening just a little more now, because it was clearer than before, subtle, but there, like a quiet signal beneath the surface of everything else. Behind her, laughter erupted again as Daniel made another remark, completely unaware, completely unbothered, living in a moment where everything felt controlled and secure. Sophie exhaled softly, her decision forming, because sometimes doing the right thing meant risking being dismissed, and she began to stand, ready to approach, ready to speak, when suddenly a server passed between them, drawing Daniel's attention away once more as a new group of guests arrived. More greetings, more distractions, more reasons for him not to notice anything beyond his immediate world. Sophie hesitated, her eyes shifting between the panel and the crowd, the distance between what she knew and what she could say feeling wider than it should have been, and for a brief moment, it seemed like she might step back, like she might let it go. Like so many small warnings in life that get overlooked simply because they are inconvenient. But then the hum shifted ever so slightly, just enough to erase any doubt. And Sophie's expression changed from uncertainty to quiet resolve, because she understood something no one else here did, that sometimes the smallest details carried the biggest consequences. And while Daniel Brooks continued to command the room, completely certain of his control, Sophie Turner was the only one who could see how fragile that control really was, and she was running out of time to decide whether she would let him remain in the dark or force him to finally see what he had been ignoring all along. Sophie stepped forward, weaving carefully through the crowd, her eyes fixed on Daniel as he laughed with a group of investors near the edge of the pool, her heart beating just a little faster, not from fear, but from urgency, because the faint hum behind her had shifted again, slightly louder now, slightly sharper, like a warning growing more insistent with every passing second, and she knew she could not wait any longer. "Sir," she said, her voice calm but clear as she approached, just enough to cut through the noise without causing a scene. But Daniel did not turn immediately, too absorbed in his conversation, forcing her to speak again. "Sir, I need to let you know something about the pool equipment." And this time he did turn, slowly, his expression already edged with irritation at being interrupted, especially by someone he had already dismissed earlier. "What is it now?" he asked, his tone controlled but unmistakably impatient, the kind of tone that made people step back. Apologize, disappear, but Sophie held her ground, her posture steady. "There might be an issue with the electrical panel near the filtration system. I think it should be checked right away," she said, choosing her words carefully, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just direct. But Daniel let out a short breath, almost a laugh, glancing briefly toward where she pointed before looking back at her. "You think," he repeated, the words carrying just enough sarcasm to draw a few quiet smirks from the people around him. "I have a full maintenance team that costs more per month than you probably make in a year. I am sure if there was a real problem, they would have found it." His voice remained smooth, but the dismissal was absolute, final, as if her concern did not even qualify as information worth considering. Sophie did not react to the comment itself, but her eyes flicked once more toward the panel, the sound now unmistakable to her, and she tried again. "I understand, but it does not sound right. It would only take a minute to check." And for a split second there was silence, a small pause where the decision could have gone either way, but Daniel shook his head slightly, already turning back to his guests. "It is a party, not a repair shop. Handle what you are supposed to handle and let the professionals deal with the rest," he said, ending the conversation as cleanly as he would close a business deal, leaving no space for argument. Sophie stood there for a moment, the weight of his dismissal settling in, not surprising, but still frustrating, because she knew what she heard, she trusted it, and yet the gap between knowing and being heard felt wider than ever in that moment. Around her, the music continued, glasses clinked, conversations resumed as if nothing had happened, and Daniel was already smiling again, fully back in control of his carefully curated world. But Sophie turned her gaze back to the pool, her focus narrowing, her instincts refusing to quiet down, because sometimes being ignored did not make something less real. It only made it more dangerous. She walked back toward the edge slowly, her movements more deliberate now, her attention locked on that small panel. The hum now pulsing faintly like a signal that refused to be silenced, and as she knelt again, her hand hovering just above the surface of the water, she could feel that something was not right, not yet visible to anyone else, but present, building, waiting, and behind her, Daniel Brooks continued to laugh under the glow of the lights, completely unaware that the moment he had just brushed aside was about to return in a way he could not ignore, and this time, there would be no easy way to dismiss it. The air began to cool as evening settled in, and the soft glow of the pool lights reflected across the water, giving everything a calm, almost perfect appearance. But Sophie could feel the tension building beneath that surface, subtle yet undeniable, like a quiet warning that refused to fade. And as she knelt closer to the edge, her attention locked onto the faint vibration she could now sense not just through sound, but through the slight ripple pattern near the filtration area, something that did not match the steady rhythm of a properly running system. She reached toward the control panel again, not touching it, just observing, her eyes scanning for anything visible, anything that could confirm what she already suspected, but from the outside it still looked normal, polished, expensive, flawless, just like everything else in Daniel Brooks' world. Behind her, the party continued without pause. Music flowing into laughter, conversations layering over one another as if nothing could disrupt the carefully crafted atmosphere, and Daniel stood near the center once again, surrounded by guests who listened closely as he spoke about expansion plans, numbers, future projections, his voice steady and confident. The voice of someone who believed he understood how everything worked, how everything could be managed. Sophie stood up slowly, glancing back at him one more time, knowing she had already tried to warn him, knowing he had made his choice, but also knowing that ignoring something did not make it disappear, and for a moment she considered walking away completely, leaving it to the professionals he trusted so much, letting responsibility fall exactly where he believed it belonged. But the thought did not sit right with her, because she had seen this kind of thing before, small oversights, turning into larger problems simply because no one wanted to interrupt the moment. The hum shifted again, slightly sharper now, and Sophie's decision became clear, not driven by authority or permission, but by instinct and responsibility, and she moved quickly toward the side access panel, her steps more urgent but still controlled, careful not to draw unnecessary attention. As she reached the panel, she crouched down and leaned closer, her focus narrowing completely, tuning out the music, the voices, the entire atmosphere behind her, until all that remained was the faint, irregular vibration she could now clearly identify as something unstable, something that should not be ignored any longer. At the same time, Daniel raised his glass again, smiling as someone congratulated him, his attention fully absorbed in the present moment, completely unaware that only a few feet away, Sophie Turner was making a choice that would soon affect everything around him. She exhaled slowly, her hand hovering near the panel as she assessed what she could safely do without causing more harm, knowing that acting too quickly could make things worse, but waiting too long could allow the problem to grow. And in that brief moment of calculation, the distance between their worlds became clearer than ever. Daniel surrounded by control, certainty, and recognition. Sophie alone with a quiet understanding of something no one else seemed to notice. The lights flickered ever so slightly, almost invisible, just enough to make Sophie's eyes lift toward the pool again, her expression tightening as the pattern of ripples shifted in a way that confirmed her concern, and behind her, a few guests paused for a split second before returning to their conversations, brushing off the subtle change as nothing, because in a place like this, problems were not expected, not acknowledged unless they were obvious. Sophie stood up quickly now, her calm replaced with urgency, turning back toward Daniel with a look that carried more weight than before, because this was no longer just a possibility, it was becoming a reality. And as she took her first step toward him again, the fragile illusion of control that filled the entire space was already beginning to crack, even if no one else could see it yet. Sophie moved faster now, her steps cutting through the soft hum of conversation as the faint flicker in the lights grew just a little more noticeable, not enough to alarm the crowd, but enough to confirm what she already knew. And as she approached Daniel again, her voice carried a sharper urgency this time. "Sir, this cannot wait," she said, her tone still controlled but firmer than before, and this time a few heads turned, the shift in her voice drawing more attention than her words alone. But Daniel's expression tightened immediately, irritation flashing across his face as he turned toward her, clearly unhappy. To be interrupted again, especially in front of people whose opinions he valued. "I told you already," he said, his voice lower now, more pointed. "Handle your job and stop creating problems where there are none." But Sophie did not step back this time, her focus unwavering as she met his gaze. "This is not a guess. Something is wrong with the electrical system near the water. It needs to be checked now." And for a brief moment, the tension between them became visible to everyone nearby. The contrast between authority and insistence, between dismissal and certainty. A guest shifted uncomfortably, another glanced toward the pool, but Daniel let out a short breath, shaking his head slightly as if he were dealing with an inconvenience he did not have time for. "You are overstepping," he replied, his tone calm but firm, the kind of calm that carried finality. "There are protocols, there are people assigned to those tasks, and you are not one of them." His words drawing a clear line, not just about responsibility, but about place, about who was allowed to speak and who was expected to remain silent. Sophie's jaw tightened slightly, not out of anger, but out of urgency, because while he spoke about structure and order, the subtle signs around them were becoming harder to ignore, the light flickering again, just a fraction longer this time, the ripple in the water shifting in a way that felt unnatural, and she knew that every second spent arguing was a second lost. "Please," she said, the words simple but weighted with intention. "Just look at it for 1 minute." And this time her voice carried something different, not just insistence, but a quiet confidence that made it harder to dismiss entirely. Daniel hesitated for the briefest moment, his eyes flicking toward the pool, then back to her, caught between maintaining control and acknowledging something he did not fully understand. But the presence of his guests tipped the balance, and he straightened slightly, his expression resetting into the composed confidence he was known for. "Enjoy the evening," he said to the group, turning away from Sophie as if closing a door, signaling that the conversation was over, that the moment had passed, that nothing needed to change. A few polite smiles followed, the atmosphere attempting to settle back into place, but the subtle tension remained, lingering beneath the surface like a note that did not quite resolve, and Sophie stood there for a second longer, watching him return to his world of certainty, her mind already moving past the conversation, past the dismissal, focusing instead on what needed to be done. She turned sharply, heading back toward the panel with more urgency than before, her movements quick but controlled, because waiting for permission was no longer an option. And as she reached the edge of the pool again, the hum was no longer faint. It was clear, steady, and wrong, and the water itself seemed to carry a slight, unnatural vibration that sent a chill through her instincts. Behind her, Daniel lifted his glass once more, smiling as if nothing had changed. But the truth was already unfolding just out of his sight, and Sophie Turner, the person he had just dismissed twice, was now the only one moving toward it, the only one who understood that whatever was building beneath the surface was about to reach a point where it could not be ignored by anyone. Sophie dropped to one knee beside the access panel, her focus completely locked in now as the hum grew steady and unmistakable, no longer something that could be brushed off as background noise. And she reached carefully toward the edge of the casing, not opening it yet, just feeling the faint vibration through the metal, confirming what her instincts had been warning her about from the beginning. And for a brief second, she closed her eyes, steadying her breathing, because she knew this was the moment where hesitation could cost time she did not have. Behind her, the rhythm of the party continued, but it was beginning to shift, small signs slipping through the cracks, a guest glancing up as the lights flickered again, slightly longer this time. Another guest pausing mid-sentence as the music skipped for a fraction of a second before continuing. Subtle disruptions that most people would ignore, but that collectively signaled something was off. Sophie stood up quickly, scanning the area around her, calculating what she could do without specialized tools, without access to the full system, because she understood that whatever was happening was building toward a point where it would no longer stay contained. She looked toward the pool again, her eyes narrowing as she noticed a faint shimmering pattern beneath the surface that did not match the usual reflections, something uneven, something unstable. And that was enough to push her into action. She turned sharply, moving along the edge of the pool, her voice cutting through the noise with urgency now. "Everyone needs to step back from the water," she called out, not loud enough to cause panic, but firm enough to draw attention, and a few guests turned, confused at first, exchanging uncertain looks as they tried to understand what was happening. But Daniel was still mid-conversation, his back partially turned, unaware of how quickly the situation was changing. Sophie repeated herself, her tone stronger this time. "Please step back from the pool." And this time more people reacted, a couple near the edge taking a cautious step back, their expressions shifting from confusion to mild concern, the atmosphere beginning to ripple with uncertainty. Daniel finally turned again, his brows drawing together as he took in the scene, the shift in energy, the attention now moving away from him and towards something he did not control, and he stepped forward, his voice firm. "What is going on?" he demanded, not angry yet, but clearly unsettled by the disruption, and Sophie met his gaze without hesitation. "There is a problem with the system. People need to move away from the water now," she said, her words direct, leaving no room for interpretation. For a moment, the two of them stood in that space between authority and urgency, between disbelief and instinct, and Daniel glanced toward the pool, the subtle flicker of the lights catching his attention again, the faint shift in the water now just noticeable. Enough to register, but not yet enough to fully convince him. The guests were beginning to murmur now, stepping back more deliberately, the easy confidence of the party dissolving into cautious awareness. And Sophie moved along the edge, guiding people back with calm, steady gestures, her focus on creating distance, buying time, doing what she could with what she had. Daniel watched her, his expression tightening as the reality of the moment began to press against his certainty. Because for the first time that evening, something was happening that he had not planned, not predicted, and not controlled. And as the space around the pool cleared, the quiet hum that Sophie had been tracking all along seemed to fill the silence, louder now, undeniable. And in that moment, Daniel Brooks realized that the situation he had dismissed twice was no longer something he could ignore, but he still did not understand how serious it was, or how quickly it was about to change everything. The space around the pool had cleared enough now that the subtle signs were no longer hidden by movement or distraction, and as the guests stepped back in uneven clusters, the quiet hum that Sophie had been tracking seemed to settle into the air, like a low warning that no one could quite ignore anymore. And Daniel stood just a few feet from the edge, his expression caught between skepticism and something new, something unfamiliar, a growing sense that the situation might not be as controlled as he had assumed. Sophie moved quickly along the perimeter, her focus sharp, her voice steady as she guided the last few people back. "Please stay clear of the water," she repeated, her tone calm but firm, and this time no one questioned her, the shift in the atmosphere speaking louder than any explanation could. The lights flickered again, longer now, enough for a few guests to exchange uneasy glances, and the music cut out for a brief moment before restarting, slightly out of sync, adding to the growing tension that was no longer easy to dismiss as coincidence. Daniel took a step closer despite the distance others were creating, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the pool, trying to understand what he was seeing, because the surface, once perfectly still, now carried a faint, irregular movement that did not match the calm evening air, and for the first time that night, he felt a crack in his certainty. "What exactly is the issue?" he asked, his voice lower now, more controlled, but lacking the earlier edge of dismissal, and Sophie turned toward him immediately, recognizing the shift. "There is likely a fault in the electrical system connected to the pool. It is becoming unstable," she explained, her words precise, not dramatic, but grounded in what she had observed. And Daniel's gaze flicked toward the panel she had pointed out earlier, the one he had chosen to ignore, the memory of that moment now sitting heavier than before. "And what does that mean?" he pressed, needing clarity, needing something concrete to hold on to. but Sophie shook her head slightly. "It means we need to shut it down immediately," she said, her urgency clear now, because the pattern of flickers, the hum, the subtle vibration in the water were all aligning into something she could no longer delay addressing. Daniel hesitated, just for a second, his instinct to maintain control colliding with the evidence. Building in front of him, and around them, the guests had fallen mostly silent, watching, waiting, sensing that something important was unfolding even if they did not fully understand it. Sophie did not wait for permission this time. Turning back toward the access panel with purpose, her movements quick but deliberate, because every moment now mattered, and as she reached it, she crouched down and carefully opened the casing just enough to confirm what she already suspected, her eyes scanning the interior with focused precision. Behind her, Daniel watched, the distance between them no longer defined by status but by understanding, and as the panel opened, the faint hum shifted again, sharper now, more urgent, and even without seeing exactly what she saw, Daniel could feel the change, the situation moving beyond uncertainty into something real. Sophie straightened slightly, her expression tightening as she turned back toward him. "We need to cut power to this system right now," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for hesitation. And this time, Daniel did not interrupt, did not dismiss, because the illusion of control he had carried all evening was no longer holding, and for the first time, he understood that the person he had pushed aside earlier was now the only one who truly saw what was happening. And as the lights flickered again, longer than before, casting brief shadows across the now quiet poolside, the moment of decision had finally arrived, and what happened next would depend entirely on whether he chose to listen or risk losing control completely. Sophie held her position by the open panel, her eyes steady as the faint vibration continued to pulse through the system, and Daniel stood just a few steps away, the weight of her words settling in as the flicker of the lights stretched longer than before, turning what had been a subtle inconvenience into something that demanded action. And for the first time that evening, he did not respond with authority or dismissal. He simply nodded once, a small but decisive shift that changed everything. "Do it," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier confidence, replaced with something more grounded, more aware, and Sophie moved immediately, reaching into the panel with careful precision, her movements deliberate as she located the correct switch, knowing that acting too quickly without certainty could make things worse, but acting too slowly could allow the instability to grow. The guests watched in near silence, their earlier conversations replaced by quiet tension, the kind that builds when control slips just enough for reality to break through. And as Sophie adjusted the system, the hum fluctuated briefly, rising and falling in uneven waves before beginning to settle, the flickering lights stabilizing for a moment, then dimming slightly as the power rerouted, and a collective breath seemed to pass through the crowd, subtle but shared. Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on Sophie, following every movement now with a focus he had not given her before, because in this moment, she was not invisible, she was central, and as the system quieted, the water in the pool began to return to its natural stillness, the irregular pattern fading, replaced by the smooth reflection of the lights above. Sophie stepped back from the panel, her posture easing just slightly as she assessed the change, her gaze moving from the equipment to the pool, then to the surrounding area, confirming that the immediate danger had passed, and only then did she straighten fully, turning toward Daniel, her expression calm but firm. "It should be stable now, but it needs a full inspection before it is used again," she said, her tone clear, professional, and for a moment Daniel did not speak, the silence stretching between them as everything he had said earlier replayed in his mind, every dismissal, every assumption, every moment he had chosen not to listen. Around them, the guests began to shift again, the tension easing, conversations slowly returning, but the energy had changed, something deeper now, something more aware, because they had all seen it, the shift in control, the moment where the person with the least status had become the most important. Daniel took a step closer, his gaze steady on Sophie, no longer looking past her, no longer seeing her as background, but as the person who had just prevented something he did not fully understand but now knew had been real and significant. You knew before anyone else, he said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization, and Sophie met his gaze without hesitation. I noticed something was off. She replied simply, not seeking recognition, just stating a fact, and that simplicity made it hit harder, because it stripped away everything else, leaving only the truth that he had chosen not to see. Daniel glanced briefly toward the panel, then back at her. The gap between what he believed earlier and what he understood now impossible to ignore, and for a moment, the entire setting around them, the mansion, the guests, the carefully curated image of success, felt smaller, less certain, because it had all depended on something he had almost overlooked. The lights held steady now, the pool calm, the danger past. But the real shift had already happened, not in the system, but in him, because as he stood there facing Sophie Turner, he understood something he had not expected to learn that night. That control was not about having power over everything. It was about recognizing when someone else saw what you could not, and choosing to listen before it was too late. The night slowly found its rhythm again, but it was not the same rhythm as before, the laughter softer, the conversations more measured, as if everyone present had felt the shift and could not fully return to what the evening had been. And Daniel remained standing near the pool, his attention no longer scattered among guests or deals, but focused on the quiet space where Sophie Turner now stood. Finishing a final check of the panel before closing it carefully, her movements calm, precise, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, even though everything had changed. For a moment, Daniel simply watched her, the weight of realization settling deeper with every second, because it was not just that she had been right, it was that he had been wrong in a way that could not be ignored, not easily explained away. And he took a step forward, closing the distance that had existed between them all evening, not measured in feet, but in assumptions. Sophie, he said, her name coming more naturally. This time, without hesitation, without the edge it had carried earlier, and she looked up, meeting his gaze with the same steady composure she had held from the beginning, neither impressed nor intimidated, just present. I misjudged you, he continued, his voice quiet but clear enough that a few nearby guests could hear, their conversations slowing again as they sensed something important unfolding. You tried to warn me, more than once, and I chose not to listen, and there was no excuse in his tone, no attempt to soften the truth, just a straightforward acknowledgement that carried more weight than any apology shaped by pride. Sophie held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, not dismissive, not overly accepting, just acknowledging what had been said, because for her, the situation had never been about recognition, it had been about doing what was necessary. Daniel glanced briefly toward the pool, now calm and still, reflecting the steady lights above as if nothing had ever been wrong. And that contrast made the moment sharper, because it reminded him how close everything had come to shifting in a way he could not control. You saw something I did not, he said, more to himself than to her, the realization settling into something he would not easily forget. And Sophie responded simply, I was paying attention. Her words direct, unembellished, and that simplicity carried the lesson more clearly than anything else could. A few guests began to approach again, curiosity drawing them closer now that the tension had passed. But they kept a respectful distance, their earlier certainty replaced with quiet observation, because they had all witnessed the same moment, the same reversal of roles that had unfolded without warning. Daniel straightened slightly, but not in the same way as before, not to assert control, but to reset himself with a different awareness, and he looked at Sophie again, not as someone beneath him, but as someone whose presence had just changed the outcome of the night. Thank you, he said, the words simple but genuine, and this time they carried none of the distance they might have earlier, just recognition. Sophie gave a small, polite nod, then turned back toward her work, not lingering in the moment, not seeking anything beyond what had already been done, and as she stepped away, blending once again into the background of the evening, Daniel remained where he was, watching her for a second longer before shifting his gaze back to the pool, the reflection steady, the surface calm, but his perspective no longer the same, because he understood now that control was not about having the loudest voice or the highest status. It was about knowing when to listen, even to the quietest one in the room. And as the night continued around him, That realization stayed, shaping the way he saw everything that followed.